Well, how y'all folks? Old Buster coming to you again. Got another old story. Old McBrayer last days. Day one. Buster done called up Jesse and Walter after he done met up with Hired at Mr. Beetle's little store. Now, Mr. Beetle had done moved off to Memphis, but he bought back his store and his boy runs it now. Well, after gathering all the boys together, Buster began to tell them all about his new ID. He was going into the grocery business and wanted to know if they would be in it with him. Now, Jesse opined that he sure did remember when they was youngins and he worked at the radio station before it burnt down. That's when he done come up with Little Dub's Wonder Cream. That and the ice water they sold put them where they are today for sure. Well, let's hear this idea, yourn, Buster, says Jesse. Boys, I was a-cooking over the fire down on Indian Bayou and got to thinking. That there beaver I done killed would taste mighty good with a lip-smacking barbecue sauce on it. Well, I had to stay the night to shoot blackbirds early the next morning for Grandpa Gus to keep 'em off the rice till they was done a-harvested, and I studied awful hard about what we could do to get on into a business we ain't been in before. Well, it ain't like we need the money, but I am plumb frazzled about not being able to get a good one nowadays. Too much chemicals and such in them, leastwise most of them, and they ain't fitting to eat, let alone good for a feller's body. Well, we got all manner of critters and beef and hogs that is organic, so this way we would have all our bases covered and could expand any which way we wanted to in this here grocery business. Now, I done went back a fair piece in our folks' history and found some mighty good recipes with a little twist of mine added to them. Now, these here recipes come from way back in our families on all sides, so I reckon they gotta be gooder than snuff, you know. Not only would it fill in a gap for iron beef and pork and chickens and whatnot, and would give us a leg up on selling more old McBrayer. Well, how's it, said Walter. Well, boys, said Buster, take a gander at my recipes for the barbecue sauce and some drinks that would sell more old McBrayer. I understand we got us a premium whiskey next to none with demand a-soaring, but a new facility would make it possible to make a bigger splash with them fancy pants folks over in Europe. Now, Charlie and Steve could even set up a distillery in Australia. Well, let's get a gander at what all you got, said Hart. Well, first off, Buster said, this here's the barbecue sauce. Then I'll show y'all the drinks I was talking about. Now, I know y'all might have some other ideas, and that's all right. We can put them into the mix, too. The mead ain't nobody selling on the market. Read 'em and weep, 'cause we ought to be doing this a long time ago. Well, old Buster, he give up the recipe on the barbecue sauce and some drinks and whatnot. And I'm telling you, folks, I'll give you the original recipes and stuff if you write Buster and the Boys at yahoo.com. Well, have you figured on what it's going to cost for a startup, asked Jesse. Well, twixt what all we got going on now and what all we's going to need in the future, yeah, it'll fit right on in with our plans. Didn't you say we need some more tax deduction, Jesse? Well, sure enough do, he said. Hired's toys is a waning thin with his deal with the government a fooling a lot of the stuff that they're building, and, well, they're footing the bill now. Reckon we earned our keep and don't have to back up none to the pay window, said Howard. Well, rightly so, but this new administration ain't a-doing us no favors. Well, Walter stepped up and said, I'm for it, but I got some ideas to go along with all this. Reckon we can all probably do that and put it into place, but it sure does put us in an area of business we ain't been in before. Well, Jesse said Buster's thinking is right on, and he liked the idea of getting into the world market as well. With our fleet of planes and trucks, we can get product anywhere in the world overnight. Boys, I'm convinced we can become a player in all markets and all countries. It's just a matter of timing and time. Just let your mind figure on all the products we can supply with making a reputation in this market from old McBrayer. Y'all know we got the space on Strawberry Hill and labor's there too. What do y'all say? Well, all the boys hollered yes. Every one of the three boys slapped Buster on the back, and Walter told him he was using that there head of his for more than a hat rack. I just knowed sooner or later them brains of yourn would show up, said Howard. Now you got to put both them muscles and brains to work, Buster quipped Jesse. Day 3. Old Jesse called a meeting with all their friends and families that they could round up to get them all involved in some way or another. And this grand old scheme was supplying a world market of products. Well, Buster brung out a list of all the friends and family that ought to be included with space for more if need be. Well, here's a list, said Buster. I got some more information in the list, but don't pay no never mind to it. Jesse told them all that it would start off with just Buster's ID, but would escalate so fast it'd make their heads swim. Now, all the folks at the meeting had a history together and vowed to help however some they could. The information gathering was to begin right away for products and associated products wanted and needed from every country. Marketing campaigns was already in the works, said Jesse. Well, all the boys come together and agreed that this here enterprise were for all of them, and unless they had fun and fulfillment, it just wasn't worth the hassle of them. We just ain't been through all we all been through to not do good for ourselves and families, but for other folk that need a leg up too. Now, all of us is God-fearing and believe and live what the Bible tells us and live in our faith to do all we can, so all we got to do is work for the service of the Lord. We've been blessed, and He put this on us to do so. We got to do it. Plus, it was my ID, said Buster. Well, everybody else laughed with him, and Buster said then, well, let's eat. That boy always eating. Day 4. The next day, Jesse and all the boys, as well as their families, got together to come up with a list of products and services that would expand the Four Winds Empire. Well, Dub spoke up and said that there beef, you got a whole passel of things to get into when you go to getting it all set up to put in the markets. Ranching is just a drop in the bucket, said Walter. Paul is a-thinking of trucking and packing houses and vet medicines and feed yards, equipment, and a ton of other stuff. We was discussing all about this last night after the meeting, and Paul and me and our family would like to head that part of it up. Well, that's sure enough a lot to bite off, said Buster, because you have to throw in other livestock as well, like hogs and chickens. Well, Jesse said to Dubs and Walter that they could get together with their family and make a list of what they needed to come first, then they could all look over it and decide what they wanted to do. Well, Jesse said seeing how his and Paul Mike was into oil and gas and such, that they would take over that part with Charlie putting in his 2 cents worth. Well, Jesse and Buster would head up the old McBrayer whiskey along with Charlie and Steve. Now, Grandpa Gus would see to the crop and part of the equipment with Big Jim. Well, Hired would take the lead on transportation, such as planes and trucking and some rail. Well, all the boys and their paws would help in any area they was needed to get everything off the ground and up and running. Well, Jesse told them all that this here would help folks worldwide, and that was their focus. Well, Jesse wanted to set up headquarters in Zambia with Dhaka running the show over there. Well, all the friends and people they knowed would be put in charge of different divisions. Buster and Walter would coordinate security with the Presidential Corps, and Hired would do what he loved and work with the government setting up their own airlines. Well, Hired piped up and said he wanted the space side of it too. When it come up, he wanted to fly one of them spaceships. All right, Hired, you got it, said Buster and Jesse and Walter in unison. Reckon Admiral Hannibal, Pat and Coulter could help out a lot too. We have to get the planes ready to fly off to meet with people we want to be in on this from the first. The gals will have to go too, seeing how they can fly. That will let Iron Paws and Maws go where they want to go to talk to those folks they think would work out the best too. Well, we want to play this close to the vest and not tell ne'er a soul about our plans except those that need to know. We need to start buying up ground and building right off. We need to secure suppliers worldwide for materials we can't provide ourselves or won't be profitable for us. Well, Buster with Walter and Hired looking at Jesse said to Jesse that he would have to hate up all of the computer stuff and research and such. That in itself would be huge, said Hired. Well, Jesse just sighed and grinned, one step at a time, boys, and we will get her done. Y'all didn't know this, but these here are the companies we will have to have invested in that will fulfill all our needs now and in the future. Now, computer startup companies to invest in or that we have already invested in, is Versally and Scale Extreme, Cloud Passage, Clustrix, Good Data, Nutanix, Translattice. You know, it looks like this here grocery business of Buster's is going to make all our families and friends to quit their work and join together on this project, said Walter, till at least it gets up and going. Sure enough, looks like a life-changing game changer, said Howard. Reckon this here is the last days of us a-playing and sitting around on it, boys, exclaimed Buster. Old McBrayer and Four Winds is about to make their own map. Day 5, Lulu, Alma, May, Monique, and Luann all began to making calls and setting up appointments and travel arrangements the next morning. All the boys was over to the Hoot Owl having breakfast when in walked Grandpa Gus, Big Jim, Dubs, and Mac. Now, Big Jim told the boys to bring their plates and go on into the back room for a private confab. Grandpa Gus began to tell the boys what they all come for after they was all seated. Boys, we is all a mite older than y'all, and we know y'all respect our opinions. We all four feel like the main thing to do first off, I guess the main thing too, is to concentrate on banking, finance, and markets worldwide. We think y'all ought to proceed, but very slowly, till you got that part of the operation all together and running smooth. We all been through the mill with some real bad folks, and they will sure enough come out the woodwork if you start to make a bigger splash than you have already done. The Illuminati will raise our ugly old hate again and count on it, said Big Jim. We recommend we all make a trip to Washington first thing in the morning, and so fire up the general, said Mike. Y'all are going to do the flying, Howard. Day 6. All the boys and their pals jumped on the general and Howard flew them to Washington. They was a meeting with Mr. Hiram and Dalton and his folk. Mr. Holmes was long in the tooth, but wasn't going to be left out of this meeting, I can tell you that. Dalton, Lorraine, Devane, Horace, Alfred, and of course Mr. Holmes was all there at the Presidential Corps meeting room waiting for the boys. Bebe was still down in Savannah with her sister and was making do with her dementia. She wasn't never going to ever be back to normal, but everybody sure did miss her. When they got there, all the boys and their paws shook hands and hugged up real good and then got down to business. Buster went over and lit Mr. Holmes' cigar and poured him a bit of old McBrayer, even though his and Doctor would have had a hissy fit over that. He just grinned at Buster and winked. Well, Jesse cranked up the meat and began to tell Buster's idea and what all he could be done about fixing this mess the U.S. and the world was in. Well, Jesse gave them all a rundown on all the holdings and wealth they had stored up in the Four Winds Bank, in the Stronghold, and in the mountains at Jim's. Jim Rogers, that is, Jim and Marion. With all their worldwide clout, the boys were very big-time players, along with the help of the Presidential Corps. Thing was, nobody knowed what all power the boys had except in the people in this room. Now, Grandpa Gus asked the other paws if they would say their piece on how to proceed to the boys' plan. Now, Big Jim said all the rest of the paws agreed that banking, financing, and market control was where they ought to shore up and sure enough get a firm toehold before they did anything else. Well, Dubs looked over to Mr. Holmes and asked his opinion all about it. As Mac also said, they all reckoned it would be one heck of a power play, and they didn't figure the Illuminati would stand still for it. They had control way too long. Well, Buster added that they had a list of folks they could trust and could be ready in a squint to get the ball rolling. Now, Mr. Holmes said he sure enough thought that the daddies of all the boys had hit the nail on the head, and the boys didn't need to get the cart before the horse. Well, Mr. Holmes said that Dalton could provide names and contacts of men, women, and heads of organizations and corporations, as well as heads of state around the world that would go along with the plan, but it would take personal appearances of the boys and Dalton, and maybe his himself, but it could be done. Devane said it would probably take all their influence and wealth to make it fly. Walter said they was all committed to their last copper. Well, Alfred said him and Horace could help out some, but they would be better put to provide the security. Lorraine was pretty much retired now from the Corps. She could go along with Dalton or if the boys if need be. Well, looks like we ought to hit the road a-running to secure the commitments from the folks they needed to and start buying up what commodities they could to corner the markets. They knowed they had control over gold already. The strongholds to concentrate on for banking was Switzerland, England, and China, from what he knowed, said Horace. Well, Horace is right, said Dalton. As far as the grocery business was concerned, the agriculture markets need to be controlled slow but sure, said Grandpa Gus. Buster said he thought they ought to concentrate on Australia first off. Well, everybody agreed on that, especially since they was already there. Now, Mr. Holmes told all the boys and the men that he didn't do too much anymore and that Dalton run about everything, as they well know. But him, Dalton, and Hired had a little surprise for the boys. They had outfitted the helicopter of Hired's with lots of newfangled updates. Well, Hired named it the Duke. And there was another addition to their fleet, the Commander. He was a hybrid cross betwixt the SR-71 Blackbird and the X-43 scramjet. The Commander would carry 4 with speeds up to 5,000 miles an hour plus a Mach 15 or 11,418 miles an hour. The range was 8,000 nautical miles up to 80,000 feet, including the fuel to go into orbit. Infinite range while in orbit with speeds of a 13,000 miles an hour. The Commander would require a start cart, and a pneumatic one would be installed at the boys' airstrip. Also, Mr. Holmes had fixed it so a KC-135Q could refuel the Commander when needed. All the boys had to do was call and request the tanker. There would always be one available any time, day or night, by the Air Force. There was little room for cargo since it was mostly took up with fuel and armament. The newfangled, I guess there's just no way to explain this one-of-a-kind aircraft, he said. At this time, Hired was the only one other than the test pilots that could fly the darn thing. Walter better hang on to his hat when he goes for a ride in the Commander, I tell you, said Mr. Holmes. You boys are going to have to do some studying up on all this information with the fellers at Skunk Works to be able to operate and maintain that plane. Well, Dalton said the boys were going to need something like the Commander since they is going into who knows what. Well, Mr. Hiram called in many a favor for you boys with this plane. Well, let's saddle up, said Dubs. Time's a wasting. Yep, said Grandpa Gus. Y'all are burning daylight. Day 7. First off, Hired, Jesse, and Dalton took off to Switzerland to meet with some bankers they knowed that would align themselves with them if and all the cards fell into place. To them it was a matter of making money. The more shady shysters was to be dealt with by the Presidential Corps, but secrecy was the order of the day this time. Since the Commander could put the boys anywhere in the world in 90 minutes or less, their first stop, or well, I guess it'd be their next stop, was China. First stop since Switzerland. This was a dicey one for sure, but with Louis Chain's contacts and Dalton's and Jesse's would be able to talk turkey with their hay knockers over there. Again, it was all about the money, and Jesse and Dalton was holding all the right cards right now. Well, next stop would be England. This was the land of the Illuminati. Now, their stronghold and stranglehold on the world's economy was there. Buster's influence come in here, and the Tipton name was royalty over there. Well, nowadays there was money there, but mostly they was a figurehead just like the Queen. But in this case, the Rothschild and Meyer clans had a major contender. With the Queen and Prime Minister on board, there was a real good chance of making more than a dent in their empire. The boys returned home with a job well done. Here in the States, financial control could be handled pretty much with the exception of the Federal Reserve. But they could be put out to pasture real quick by Congress. As was said, it was all about the money for them boys. If the boys could make inroads in banking, finance, and the markets, it could be done. The markets would be the hardest by far. Mr. Holmes was way up in years now, and the boys was right there behind him. Grandpa Gus was about the same age as Mr. Holmes, pushing 90, but could still get on around right well. He was tougher than a boot and with leather and a nickel stake too. Most of the folks had their share of problems with age, but still maintained an active lifestyle. They still worked their places, but nowadays there was folks to help them that took the burden off of them. They could do as they pleased pretty much. All the boys met up at Buster's house because Buster had a hankering for some pan-fried taters and fried peach pies and plum dumplings. And Grandma Clara had put on a pork roast with sauerkraut corn and mashed taters, gravy, and homemade rolls and fresh churned butter. Along with her cottage cheese lime jello salad with pineapple and pecan, she had a wilted lettuce leaf salad, Cairo nut pie, and candied green beans, and sliced tomatoes, and her asparagus she raised out by the front porch. Well, after all the eating was done and a snort of old McBrayer, all the boys and their folks began to discuss their next move. Buster was going to go see Jim and Marion and see if he thought they should buy any more land next to his mountain and get an idea of how much gold they could get. Now, it was right important to see if Jim could get more out of his mountain or if there was more thereabout. Lulu said she would go with Buster. Well, everybody else was going to Australia to see Charlie and Caroline and begin getting everything ready to go there. Steve and Sandra June would head on back to the mansion along with Elizabeth Jane and Bo, with Horace going with them. Now, Alfred would go with the rest of the boys to Australia. Dalton and Devane was planning and plotting back in Washington, seeing what they had to do to the senators and congressmen. Things was on the back burner for the president because he was going out and the new one coming in. It remained to be seen what all he'd be up to. When all the boys and their folks got to Australia, Charlie had a report that Dubs wanted to see. It was all about livestock and agriculture. Charlie passed it out whilst Caroline offered up whatever everybody wanted to drink and some of them little sandwiches too. Well, after all that information on both countries, Jesse said he was interested, in. He says, in my opinion, I think we to concentrate on Australia first and then decide where to go. Dubs and Grandpa Gus said they felt the same way. The history of the boys doing business and their experience and contacts would make a world of difference in implementing the plan, especially with Charlie being here as long as he has. Well, all the boys and their folks agreed on Australia first and then went to get some rest and freshen up a mite before supper. The adventure is on, said Walter. They ate. Well, Buster and Lulu didn't go with the rest of the boys and folks, but instead stayed behind to go see Jim and Marion Rogers. They needed to talk to them personal-like, and talking turkey was eye to eye. Buster and Lulu took the lady, and Lulu done the flying. It was round about 1,600 miles, and Lady's range was about 3,000. Buster got into Jim's place with Lulu as usual. Jim seed 'em a-comin'. Marion met 'em with hug-ums and kisses and told 'em to get theirself in there. She had all manner of good eats for Buster and Lulu, so she said she hoped Buster brung his an appetite. Well, old Buster belly laughed at that, I tell you. He always had an appetite. Well, after supper, they all sit down for a confab, and Buster started off by asking Jim and Marion if they knowed what all they was trying to do. Jim said they knowed most of it, but not all of it, and would Buster explain to them what it was all about. Well, said Buster, the U.S., and in fact the world, is in a short enough pickle. The Federal Reserve and Wall Street controlling gas prices and markets along with the big banks and finance company are killing this country and the world. Now we also know that Congress, the President, and the Supreme Court have got things upside down too. Nothing again making money or having it, but when it goes against the Constitution, it is pure treason. Now, Mr. Holmes and Dalton, along with us boys, aim to change things a mite. But as you know, them dregs of the Illuminati ain't a-gonna like that none, not near at all, so here's the plan. First off, we'd have taken stock of how much gold we have to try to get us back on the gold standard. As it stands, we figure twixt all of us, we have near about 7 times what the world has. What we need to know is about how much more do you think you got here in your mountain, and if there is other property around here you think we ought to get. Well, Jim said my vein has about petered out, but I done found where she picks up, and she led me to the chimney, they call it. There ain't a rock in this here mountain that ain't mineralized. The main vein splits to 4 more veins, with the smallest being 12 foot wide. Dang, you gotta be kidding, said Buster. Any idea how much she's worth? No telling, but it is the hundreds of billions of dollars, said Jim. I would suggest that if we could buy up all the property around my mountain, we would be worth several $1 trillion. Well, that skinned the cat, I can tell you. I reckon it will take some palavering, but Jesse, Mr. Holmes, and Dalton can get her done. I really want to keep this low key, said Jim. No full-scale mining operation. I'll get her done myself. No problem that I can see, said Buster. With Iron Bank and financing and trading, the in-ground assets won't be no need of anybody even knowing anything is different than it is now. Well, that's wonderful, said Marion. Jim and I want to keep this place as pristine as possible. Well, we'll be in touch, but don't y'all worry none. By the way, Hired wanted to know about the pups and Wolf. Well, Wolf don't get around much anymore, and the pups is full grown and got pups of their own. They come by time to time, and they know we's family. Tell Hired he needs to come and visit for a spell with them. Sure will, said Buster. Now, how about some more of that there pie, Marion? I was plumb famished. Caving in. Well, Lulu whacked him right smart and told him to behave, and Jim and Marion just howled over that. Buster and Lulu left on out the next morning, and conference called Jesse, Mr. Holmes, and Dalton on the secure line from the plane and give them a report on what all Jim had to say. The lady was a right fine airplane, and her range was about 3,000 miles, like I said, so to get to Victoria, Australia, they had to refuel a bunch of times. The boys needed the lady over there for a number of reasons. One being they owned her, and she was modified to the hilt. Plus, they didn't know how long they was going to be there and where they would be going. Now, some of the runways just might not accommodate their bigger planes. The route Buster and Lulu was going to take had them a refueling in L.A. after leaving Jim and Marion. Then at Hawaii and Johnson Atoll and Majuro and Marshall Islands and San Cristobal, Solomon Islands, and on into Victoria, Australia. Quite the trip. Buster and Lulu wanted a little time alone, seeing as they never did have them a honeymoon proper, where they could spend some time together and have a little fun. A mini-moon, Buster called it. Now, Johnson Atoll Airport was closed in 2005, but Dalton fixed it so Buster could refuel there from the military that was there on maneuvers. Now, Lulu was taking pictures and getting all kinds of doodads and information for the gals, and she had a lot of that stuff she got for them and was going to show them when she got there. Well, the first stop was 3 nights in the Hawaiian Islands at the Hilo International Airport where they landed, and they went to the Four Seasons Resort. Well, don't get me them names, in Hualala or something Villa. Their second stop, was only to refuel, was on Johnson Atoll. Their third stop, they stayed one night in Majuro, Marshall Islands. Their fourth stop to refuel was the Solomon Islands, Macura, or San Cristobal they called it. Refueled and raring to go, being Victoria by nightfall. Lulu is happier than a pig in sunshine. Me too. Day 11. When Buster and Lulu arrived at the Southern Cross, they was met by Charlie and Caroline, and Charlie wanted to show them around the place since they had completed all the building projects. Well, first off, there was a new airstrip and hangars. One for each of their planes and 4 more for other planes that might come for a visit or business. 16 in all. State-of-the-art control tower and their own FBO, which is called a fixed base operator. Secondly, there was houses. Each of the boys had their house built to their specifications, and each one had a guest house. Now, they was spectacular, I'm telling you. Charlie and Caroline had their own too, and it was big enough for their triplets and their folks. Well, we got pictures of Walter Luann's house and Charlie and Caroline's house and Buster and Lulu's house, Jesse and Monique's house. Y'all just write, like I said, to Buster and the boys at yahoo.com, and I'll send you all that. Well, there was half a dozen smaller houses for folks that would visit or on business about a quarter mile off and away from a subdivision, so to speak, about 50 houses for folks that worked there. Now, each house had their own transportation available for their use. There was a free 24-hour grocery store, power, water, and sewer plants. It was basically a small town that they built with all manner of services, including a doctor, nurse, and a small hospital, a school, and a church house for sure. Everybody that worked for the Southern Cross was Christians. They sure enough believed in God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. At the center of the hub was the office and conference center and hotel. Now, all the staff and workers were screened and vetted before they was hired. They was all paid well, very well. There weren't no vacations worked, and they were on their own and supervised by Charlie or who he designated. Now, everybody worked on the honor system. feller could come to work when he needed to. If it was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so be it. If it was for an hour a month, so be it. They done what needed to be done. They had all kinds of benefits too. Southern Cross paid for everything needed for the employee and the employee's family, including education for the youngins when they finished school there at Southern Cross. However long it took for a feller to get well is how long it took, and he kept on getting his regular paycheck. If he still worked for Southern Cross when he reached retirement age, he kept on getting his regular paycheck till him and his wife both passed. Well, after their little tour around the place, they all met up at the conference center with all the boys and the folks. Charlie said they could take a tour later on because 500,000 acres was just the start now. They had added more land since they was last there. Now, Buster's eyes plumb bugged out over that, I tell you. When everybody had got something to drink and snack on and got settled, Jesse told them, we got to talk. Now, I got some information about what all we got to do to make this here plan of ours work. Now, these are the things we need to concentrate on. Energy, oil, heat and oil, natural gas, unleaded gas. Metals, gold, silver, platinum, copper, and rare earth metals. Agriculture, corn, soybeans, wheat and rice. Meat and livestock, lean hogs, live cattle, feeder cattle. Consumer, cocoa, coffee, cotton, and sugar. I can tell y'all we are making major inroads in metals, meat and livestock, and agriculture. We are strong in consumer, in cotton and sugar, but we are weak in oil. About that time in walked Dalton and Devane with Lorraine and Lynn. Well, what in the world, said Buster, y'all decided to take a little vacation? And you gals we ain't seed in a month of Sundays. Well, all the gals went to a hugging and a kissing, and all the boys shook hands excepting Buster. He bar hugged every one of them pert near to death, with Devane just a squealing. Come clean now, let's hear it. Mr. Holmes send you? Well, reckon he did, said Dalton. He wanted us to talk in person, so we got us a military plane to bring us on over. We was going to stay at St. Patrick's Luxury Boutique Hotel in Garoy. It ain't but 2 miles away, you know, and I told Vivian that I'd confirmed supper for all of us over there this evening. Is that all right with all y'all? Well, there was a resounding yes from everybody. Well, Dalton called and confirmed supper for the whole gang and wanted Vivian and her folks there too. She said they would be happy to get together with them all. Now, down to business, said Devane, and handed out a list to everybody. Dalton said this was a list of the most powerful banks in the world, and they needed to talk about them. Here's what was on the list. And they had the top, 50 or so banks there was. They had lots of them. And Jesse said, you sure going to have to do some moving and shaking, but it can be done. Most all the banks in all the countries, except in the UK, Germany, and some of the Switzerland, will go along with you, I think, said Dalton. You're sure enough going to be busy, I tell you, a traveling man at that, too. The UK, Germany, and Swiss banks are traditionally Illuminati controlled, but you can bypass them with the clout and assets of Four Winds Bank. Fact is, nobody knows the amount of assets Four Winds has. Once you pull the rug out from under a few of the hardheads at them banks, they will roll over. I'll be going with you, Jesse, said Dalton. Well, Dalton said that him and Devane would like to ask a favor of the boys. Well, heck yeah, said Howard and Buster about the same time. What is it? Well, we would like for you to let Lorraine and Lynn stay here at the Southern Cross till all this mess is over with. Well, Buster jumped up and grabbed a hold of Dalton and said, any time, all the time. Devane come over and grabbed Buster and dang near made him swallow his tongue. He squeezed him so hard. Whew, said Buster. I knowed you was stout, but I didn't think you was that stout. Give me a run for my money, I tell you. Well, everybody just hollered and hooped and laughed at that, I tell you. Well, Dalton said him and Mr. Holmes looked at the folks on Buster's list, and not a one of them wasn't top notch. And Mr. Holmes said, you're surely going to need the help with all you got on your plate. Plus, if and everything goes all right, the Presidential Corps would use some of them from time to time. Well, I think old Bill Kimmel and Big Mike Young need to get on over here now, said Buster. Bill is one heck of a cowboy for sure, and his is even though he's still a little bit long in the tooth. Well, Big Mike can build and fix anything, and we sure got projects. Just turn him loose. But there ain't going to be no radios nor cell phones on his job, I tell you. He tells them they are there to work, not for entertainment. Charlie, I got a question for you. Was you able to get the big toilets and bathrooms in every one of the houses? Sure did, says Charlie. And for St. Patrick's as well, said Buster. Yep, says Charlie. Thank you for that, Charlie. Well, everybody just looked at them two like they done lost their minds, but Lulu knowed what it was all about. She tells everybody that Buster wants big toilets everywhere he goes, so he buys them for everybody. He said all them others is for midgets, and he's as soon have an outhouse as one of them. Oh, boy. Well, that took the cake, I tell you. Walter and Hired was just rolling on the floor. Well, Walter yells, "What did that cost you?" "Don't rightly know. You and Hired paid for half of them." Well, then all of them piled on each other like they was 2-year-old again and began to wrestling on the floor. The gal said they was just plumb pitiful and told Lorraine and Lynn to look at what they had to put up with. Well, after all the hullabaloo, everybody left on out to St. Patrick's for supper and visit with Vivian, Stephen, Bill, and Dawn. Well, after all the meeting and shaking hands and hugging and kissing, they all sat down to eat. Now, all the gals wasn't going to let Dawn and Vivian do all the work, so they all pitched in to get supper on the table. After Ms. McBrayer, Sarah, and Howard both offered up prayers, and the eating commenced. Boy, what a feast. Then Vivian said she and Stephen and Bill and Dawn wanted to thank them for all they done for them. "Well, what's that?" asked Alma May. "For the benefit of everybody that don't know." "Well, there's 3 new houses for each of us, and they are set back enough for our privacy and not to detract from St. Patrick. Then the new 20-room hotel built just like St. Patrick. This will keep us busy all the time now. Speaking of that, Vivian, we got something to discuss with you." Then Jesse and Dalton told them all about the plan and wanted to be part of it. Bill said, "You dang tootin', I'm in." Well, Vivian said they could work out any details, but would do whatever was asked of them. "Well, first off," said Charlie, "ain't no telling who or how many is going to be coming to these parts. You got room now. Another thing we need, Bill helping us out to scout property and facilities and all manner of other things here in Australia. We got William and his people to take care of, and we need a native of Australia with contacts to help out Charlie." "Well, just name the time and place. We'll be there," said Bill. "Speaking of William, me and Lulu need to try to find him tomorrow. Can you go, Bill?" "Well, sure enough can. Best if we have a helicopter, though," said Bill. "It's done," said Hire. "I'll fly the 4 of us." Well, after supper, they had a bit of old McBrayer, and Jesse got out his and fiddled and played a bit. "Right enjoyable," said Dubs and Grandpa Gus. "Well, time for bed," said Jesse. "Long day tomorrow." Well, everybody said good night. Dalton, Lorraine, Devane, and Lynn stayed at the St. Patrick. Buster said y'all are mini-mooning and left out a laughing. Day 12. Hired flew Buster, Lulu, and Bill to find William and the Peel-Wrong Aborigines. About 2 hours out and fuel to spare, Bill spotted them sitting in the shade waiting till dusk to head on out for who knows where. When William seen Buster, when he landed, he come up and greeted him with a smile. They had gone through the welcome to country and were not considered strangers. Well, Buster and asked William if him and Bill could sit a spell and talk. William showed him where to sit. Now Lulu went off with the women folk to talk and prepare something for supper. Now, Buster told William of the plan for the U.S. and Australia and the world. He said he would need his help sooner or later. As a Cheyenne dog soldier, he considered William his brother. Well, Buster told William of the land they now owned, over 1 million acres, and that he wanted them to feel free to travel anywhere on it they wanted to and to take whatever they wanted. If there was any problem, to talk to Charlie or Bill, and they would get in touch with him if they needed him to get it straightened out. Buster said he knowed there was no words for thank you, but whatever they did come from the heart. Buster said his heart was full and pure for William and the Peel-Wrong. William nodded, his too. William then spoke of many bad men and a war to come. But all was not lost. When he needed help, help would be there from Black Kettle and the Cheyenne dog soldiers and William and the Peel-Wrong. Buster just nodded. Buster said he could not come back to Australia and not visit his friend William. It made his heart happy and free as a night wind. Well, Buster and Hired spoke of many things, and Hired was good with critters as usual. Bill spoke the lingo, and Lulu was mesmerized at what all the women did in the tribe. Well, after the meal, they said, until we meet again, and left on out back to the Southern Cross. But before they left, Buster give William one of them survival knives with a locator in it, like the one hired to give the boys where he found Jesse in the swamp. Well, that's when Yvette was born. Whilst they was out, Hired flew him over the holdings of the Southern Cross. Old Charlie and his men had done one heck of a job, I tell you. Lulu just couldn't believe all what she saw. Well, Jesse and Dalton had made plans to leave the next morning to begin seeing all the hay knockers at the banks. They'd take the commander because of his speed, and Dalton had made arrangements to be refueled in the air. When Buster got in, Jesse asked Buster if he would call Louis Chang and see if he couldn't meet in Beijing, China. They had much to discuss and needed him with them there. Louis said he would charter a plane within the hour and tried to get there before they did. Well, what Dalton found out was North Korea was a problem. They had over 20 bank accounts in China, in Switzerland, and over 120 trade companies handled by Room 39. Now, he showed Jesse the intel that they gathered on that. And it was something, I tell you. Day 13, on the way over as Dalton was flying the commander, Jesse reviewed the information on the banking and finance situation and the major players. Their first stop was Basel, Switzerland, and the Bank for International Settlements. And there was all this information that was prepared that they got to read. Well, with all that information that Jesse had figured, he could make a deal they couldn't refuse, especially with Dalton's help. Plus, Mr. Holmes hadn't been sitting around twiddling his thumbs neither. All of them together was a force to be reckoned with, I tell you. I can't even begin to tell you the 10 richest countries, but in order was USA, China, India, Japan, Germany, Russia, Brazil, UK, France, and Mexico. The US by far was the richest country, with China coming in second. Talking about trillions of dollars. Well, Jesse and Dalton met with Stephen English and Christian Knorr, chairman of the board of president of the BIS. Well, Jesse come right out and laid his cards on the table about the U.S. and world situation in the Illuminati. Jesse said he had options to call notes on all the banks, either flood the market with all the metals or withhold consumer products. $300 trillion in gold is not something to sneeze at, gentlemen, he said. Well, Dalton spoke up and said that there was to be a new leadership in the Federal Reserve, and it would be government owned and not privately owned anymore. Well, that throwed them for a loop, I tell you. On top of all that, wanting them to play ball with them, Dalton wanted all the North Korean bank accounts and trading companies frozen and turned over to the Presidential Court. Everything they had done was illegal anyhow. Well, Jesse told there was changes happening and to get on the bandwagon or go broke. After all, it's all about making money for you, ain't it, boys? Well, Dalton piped up and told them to start now, not to wait till later. If they did, they would sink like a lead balloon. Well, them two fellers got on the phone right then and froze all of North Korea's bank accounts and turned them over to the Presidential Court. Then they got a hold of all the leaders of the 60 banks and told them to drop everything and meet tomorrow evening with Jesse and Dalton. The boys left on out for supper and a good night's rest till tomorrow evening. In the meantime, Jesse and Dalton would be burning up the phone lines. Day 14, the next evening, representatives from all 60 banks met up with Jesse and Dalton. Everything was discussed like it was yesterday, and all of them agreed to go along with the plan. Those fellers weren't no dummies neither. They checked out what all Jesse and Dalton told them, and no day was up again it, so they had to kowtow. As Jesse and Dalton started to leave to fly to China, Dalton left them with a few choice words. If in any of you even let out a single word of the plan, y'all will rue the day you did. Y'all know who the Presidential Corps is and what we will do. So I advise you to keep your word, help your country and the world, and live another day to make more money. Nary a word was ever said neither. Well, Dalton and Jesse got to Beijing, China, and met up with Louis Chang at the American Embassy in a secure CIA meeting room. Later on that evening, Louis said he had a meeting set up the next morning with Jiang King or somebody, chairman and executive director, and Luo Xi, whoever he is, vice president of Commercial and Industrial Bank of China. The results of the meeting would apply to all the other Chinese banks as well. Day 15. Basically, Louis translated at the meeting the next morning, but the Chinese could speak English as well as any of them. Everything was said in Switzerland, but the Chinese know they had their backs against the wall, but was finally won over because they wanted back on the gold standard. There was no love lost on the Illuminati or the Federal Reserve either. They was a bit concerned about the North Koreans, but knowed they would just holler and yell, but wasn't that nuts to start a war over the money they got from crooked deals. Their accounts and trading companies was turned over to the Presidential Corps that day. Well, day 16, Jesse and Dalton got some much needed rest and ate with Louis before they left on back to Southern Cross. Jesse told Louis that Buster surely missed his and dumplings and would see him soon. Jesse also told Louis that it would be soon and they would talk about the position they would like Louis to take in the plant. Louis said he was up for whatever they needed him for. Day 17, Jesse and Dalton arrived back at the Southern Cross and got all the folks together and told them all the news. They had already talked to Mr. Holmes and filled him in on the flight over. Walter and Hired give their reports on all they was a-doing, and so did Charlie. Bill and Big Mike was there, and Big Mike was going to run over to the mansion with Hired to get a look-see on all the expansion that was needed. Well, it seemed everything was going to plan, but the big hurdle would be back in the U.S. and especially Washington. But there was lots to do before it all come to the head. Whilst everybody was gathered up, Jesse said they needed to get figured out who was going to do what in the plant. So the four boys all took to assigning the folks where they thought they would do the most good. Old Charlie would stay in Australia with Bill Kimmel along with Bill Clancy. Big Mike Young would float betwixt Australia and the mansion and wherever he would needed the ramrod projects. Doves, Grandpa Gus, and Big Jim would also come, but would float as well when needed anywhere else. Steve would come when construction on the new distillery got underway, but only to consult because of the expansion at the mansion and distillery in Kentucky. Well, Jesse, Bill, Paul, and Leonard would handle all the computer-related duties for the whole shebang. Now, since Sheena Marie was a teaching, Butch needed something to do, so the boys figured with his management abilities and knowledge of the goings-on with the Admiral, him and Bulldog could liaise, be a go-between with them folks as well, as Bulldog could head up the legal team with Lamar Green. Well, David Irwin would go along with Hired and help with what the Admiral wanted them to do. Now, Cousin Ish would see to all of the rolling stock along with Lulu's brother David and Hired. Hired would handle all the aircraft and space interdiction with Admiral Coulter. Well, big boy Billy Kane Bailey wasn't doing nothing no way except to being a pickle and playing tricks on folks, so he needed to handle the office setup in whatever place he was needed. Now, Louis Chang would be point man for China and the Caribbean and Mexico. Hartley and Nigel would help Louis and take care of their fleet too. Now, Jim Rogers would consult on all metals. Anson Johnson would help with overseeing manufacturing and anything going on in the Scandinavian countries and Alaska, Russia, and Canada. Dhaka and Winston would handle Africa and India. Stephen Clancy, Vivian Porter, Cap Morrill, and the Baileys would advise on all matters concerning food and lodging. Well, Big Mike Young over construction along with the Fontenot boys, Ernie and Greg, on infrastructure and pipeline. Now, Buster would handle security along with Dalton and Lorraine, Bo and Tad. Walter would help out in Australia and other places where his skills was needed. Now, Lulu, Lynn, Alma Mae, and Monique would help out in the food and lodging end of things. Lou Ann would take over all the medical concerns for the group. And everybody else would just pitch in whenever and wherever help was needed. Day 137, Mr. Holmes and Dalton called for an emergency meeting at Presidential Corps headquarters. All the boys, Charlie, Steve, Butch, Bulldog, and Big Mike, and their folks was there, plus Monique's brother, Pierre. Dalton started off the meeting with everybody agreeing to ultra secrecy. There was to be a coup in government, and the Presidential Corps was going to do it and needed their help. Now, Mr. Holmes said they had to do something to facilitate change in the most drastic way. First off, they had to deal with the Illuminati at Bohemian Grove in California. That's where all the most powerful men in the world gathered each year for their powwow. Now, it wouldn't be a cakewalk. Dalton said the folks involved with the Illuminati was as guilty as sin, and the boys and the rest of them would be amazed who would be there. He said that they would give them a chance to do the right thing by resigning their post or position or changing policy or assigning control to the Presidential Corps. If they wouldn't, they would be executed. Now, Mr. Holmes asked if anybody there had a problem with that, because some might think it would be cold-blooded murder. Well, Grandpa Gus spoke up and said all of their folks and them knowed what these here Peckerwoods could and would do. On with the show. They done been there and done that. Devane said that you're right, Gus. If you don't take 'em out, they is coming for you and your family and won't quit, as you well know. Mac and Dubs and Big Jim said they've been in it before and count on them to do what's necessary, and so did everybody else. Horace asked if and Big Mike would mind taking up a position with his sniper rifle, because he couldn't cover any of them unless he had some help. Well, Big Mike said he sure would, because them birds ain't no better than a plague-carrying ground squirrel. Well, Alfred give 'em all some intel about the Bohemian Grove so they would have an idea about what all takes place out there. It ain't pretty, he said. Boys, all the main players in the Illuminati will be at the owl ceremony that will happen at night, round about 12 midnight, said Dalton. Everybody will be issued night vision goggles, so practice with them and get used to how they work if you don't know. We're going to hit them straight up at midnight on July 13th. The fur is going to fly. Today is my birthday, July 7th, and the 13th is my mama's. What a coincidence, Buster told the boys. Reckon there's going to be fireworks for sure. Day 143. At the stroke of midnight, at the height of all the Illuminati hooping and a hollering, the presidential corps agents surrounded all the men. There was a few skirmishes on the outside of the meeting place, but they was put down by the boys and their folks. Dalton lined them all up and gave them the choice of doing what was right or biting the bullet. A few of them drawed shooting irons, and a few tried to run off. All of them was shot deader than a doornail. The rest of them was took to where Devane done his interrogating. The place was cleaned up, as they called it, and everything went back to normal, except it twerked. During the night, the presidential corps agents visited all the politicians that was crooked or just plain nuts or under the Illuminati control, and was given the choice of doing right or visiting Devane. Well, lots of them had accidents and heart attacks that night. The president seen the handwriting on the wall, too. Day 144. An unprecedented meeting of Congress was held the next day with the Senate and House. The current Federal Reserve was abolished and then put in the U.S. government under the Presidential Corps. The gold standard was put back into place, and the oil and gas money paid to Wall Street boys was took away, too. For the common man, all property tax was took away, as the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional. Was a pretty busy day, to say the least. The U.S. got out of the United Nations and revamped foreign policy. Whilst confirming support of Israel, Muslims was given the opportunity of pledge to the U.S. and prayer was put back in schools. God was back in government to stay, as this country was founded on Him, God Almighty. No more ACLU neither. Capital punishment was put back in place with immediate execution after all testing done. All marijuana offenders was released immediately and no more prosecution of them, but it would be taxed. The marijuana, that is. U.S. borders was set up with all manner of protections. Lasers would barbecue and ain't if and it tried to get across. Gangs was outlawed and shot. All mosques was tore down. If an American Muslim wanted to worship, he could do it in his own home. All illegal people were shipped out and given no benefits. All welfare recipients had to work or have good reason why they couldn't. If and you had a baby, the father and mother took care of them, period. No more handouts. Well, everybody could go to the doctor or dentist and had to pay 10% flat taxes. Everybody had to speak English. No more 37 different languages in school. All politicians had to abide by the law for everybody, no special treatment. Their bill and expenses would be paid but no salary. It was a privilege to serve. All countries was notified that there would be no pussyfooting around. You hurt American and we would nuke you. You stay on your side of the tracks and winds will stay on iron. Don't do nothing to affect harm on the U.S. of A. All terrorists would be shot immediately. Many more changes was to come, and the country would soon turn around, as would the world. The president and vice president resigned the next day. 1 year later, Mr. Holmes said there had to be checks and balances, and Jesse had to be placed in the Supreme Court according to the documents found at the mansion in the distillery. Buster was installed as a permanent advisor to the president for all military and policy matters. Howard was assigned to the Air Force and NASA, and Walter to the Department of Interior. the judges in the federal system was reevaluated and the bad ones discharged, one way or another. There was a special committee to override the three branches of government if the need come up by the presidential corps to make sure no outside forces could undermine the security of the United States of America. Common sense finally prevailed, as Grandpa Gus said. The plan was working remarkably well, but power would never go to the boys' heads. All they wanted to do is make a living and help folks. Just do right is what they all said. Now, Buster's barbecue sauce and dry rub was a hit, and old McBrayer was sold out all the time. Buster was all excited and called all the boys and the gals to meet him there and their folks there at the mansion in Kentucky. When they all got there, he told them he had a surprise for them. He gave them a sip of old McBrayer and Macallan Scotch and asked them what they thought. Well, said Walter, appears to be like it always was to me, and the Macallan is right good too. Well, Buster then told them to try this sip. This is right tasty, said Grandpa Gus. What is it? I'm a-going to tell you, but first let me show you. Well, if and you will notice on page 39 of the book of Macallan about American oak bourbon barrels, you will see that Macallan imports them from Kentucky. Leastwise, that's where they want to get them. Well, sir, old McBrayer has the best, according to them, and they want to make a deal for all iron. I figured that we could get Iron Foot in the door saying how we got ties there and all. We need a base of operations for old McBrayer anyhow with the McGregors. So I took Macallan Scotch, old McBrayer, and some of that joy juice Mr. McGregor give us and mixed it all up together with a mite of ripe persimmon. What you're drinking is that. Macallan and the McGregors are willing to go in with us on it, but we got to come up with a name for it. What do y'all think about that? Well, I don't know about no name, but it sure does taste good. Might as well get into that too, them boys said, Walter. I reckon that. I second that, says Hired. Jesse says we ought to, said Monique. Jesse was a busy drinking and couldn't even talk right then. All the folks hollered yes to it for sure. Well, Horace walked in about then, and anybody that he asked if they knowed much about the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. Well, Grandma Claire Orlichek said she did. Buster's great-great-aunt was a nun over in Czechoslovakia before she was killed. She worked in Ethiopia for a spell. Well, Buster piped up and said, don't y'all remember when I went to school over in England when I was in the service? I told y'all all about Prince Maconan and us being friends. Well, Horace said to let him pull it up on the internet and see what all it says about it. When he did, he showed everybody the information. Boy, it's right interesting, said Jesse. Horace, he said, let me call Doc and find out a little more about all this. What seems to be the problem so I can tell Doc? Well, Horace said one of his contacts over there heard that since they, whoever they was smart, they would show them a thing or two. After getting the ark, it would bring them to their knees. His informant was walking down a back alley in Lusaka when he heard them round the corner. He always lets me know anything unusual going on. Well, Hire said that's over 2,500 miles to Ethiopia. What in the world could that be all about? Well, I got a report in to Dalton. You just can't ever tell this day and time, said Horace. Walter said we need another adventure like we need a hole in the hay. Let's hope we don't get one, said Mr. McBrayer. Well, Buster got up and told him to get to thinking of a name for that there Scotch bourbon. The 3 M's got to be made. Who's hungry, hollered Buster. I'm a-fixing to put on a feed bag. That there barbecue sauce of mine is a-calling. Them ribs ain't got a chance, said Miss McBrayer. That boy can eat more than all of us put together. We better get, said Walter, or there won't be nothing left, and he run out of the door like a turpentine cat. That boy can eat too, said Miss Ollinger, and Hired took off too. Well, the rest of the folks all looked at each other and just shook their heads. What we gonna do with them boys, said Miss Holmes. Well, tell them to make some more money so we can feed them, said Big Jim. He was a-laughing whilst he made a beeline to the kitchen. Tomorrow is another day, but right now I hear chomping, and then Jesse took off too. Folks, that's the story for today. See y'all later. Have a blessed day. Old Buster out. Bye-bye now.